My name is Autumn Hayes, and I was 36 years old the night my father stood beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers in front of more than 100 wealthy guests and announced that my younger brother would inherit the empire I had spent most of my adult life protecting. Just before midnight, he lifted a glass of imported champagne and smiled proudly at the crowd. "As of tonight," he said, "I'm officially placing Hayes Sterling Group in the hands of my son, Grayson, the one who truly earned it." The ballroom exploded with applause. Glasses rose into the air. The jazz band shifted into something dramatic and triumphant, while people cheered like they were witnessing history. My husband, Ethan, reached beneath the table and wrapped his fingers around mine. I squeezed his hand back automatically, while everyone around us prepared for the countdown to midnight. Across the room, Grayson stood beside our father, wearing a custom charcoal suit and a smile so confident it almost looked rehearsed. The watch on his wrist probably cost more than the first apartment I ever rented after college. But nobody in that ballroom understood what was really happening. Not my father, not my brother, not the reporters standing near the stage, not the board members congratulating each other with expensive whiskey in their hands. For 14 months, I had been quietly building something they never saw coming. And at exactly midnight, while confetti rained from the ceiling and the band played through the cheers, I was going to destroy the illusion my family had spent years protecting. To understand why, you have to understand the company. Hayes Sterling Group wasn't just a business. In my father's mind, it was proof that our family mattered. My father, Richard Hayes, started the company 30 years earlier in a rented warehouse outside Dallas, with one truck, 2 exhausted employees, and loans from banks that barely trusted him enough to answer his calls. By the time I reached high school, the company had become a respected regional manufacturing and logistics operation. By the time I graduated from Northwestern with a finance degree, it had grown into a publicly traded corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 230 employees, 4 facilities, quarterly earnings calls, investors, board meetings, auditors. The kind of company that made people treat my father like a self-made king. I joined the company at 27 as a junior analyst, even though everyone assumed I would eventually land somewhere more prestigious. Within 2 years, I redesigned the company's internal audit systems from the ground up. 5 years later, during a brutal liquidity crisis that nearly pushed us into bankruptcy, I helped restructure tens of millions in short-term debt and kept payroll running while vendors threatened lawsuits. At 34, I became the youngest vice president of finance in company history. Then Grayson arrived. My brother was 29 when my father handed him the title of vice president of business development. He got a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, a corporate credit card, an assistant, and enough freedom to behave like the company was his personal lifestyle brand. What he never received was accountability. His division operated without meaningful performance metrics, no serious oversight, no measurable output standards. He attended trade conferences, shook hands with people whose names he forgot 5 minutes later, ordered expensive lunches on the company card, and called it relationship management. Meanwhile, I was the one reviewing payroll reports at 6:30 every morning. When the company recovered from the liquidity crisis, the board publicly praised leadership during a quarterly meeting. My father stood at the front of the conference room and thanked the entire executive team for their efforts in saving the business. The next day, he bought Grayson a new Porsche. That was my family. My father had a phrase he loved repeating. The first time I heard it, I was 16 years old, sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework while he talked to my mother about the future of the company. "A son carries the family name," he said. "A daughter carries the memories." I carried a lot more than memories. Richard Hayes simply never counted the weight of what his daughter carried. 3 years before that New Year's Eve party, my father hosted his 60th birthday celebration at the same estate where everything would eventually collapse. Same ballroom, same chandeliers, same orchestra, same servers folding napkins into ridiculous swans. That night, my father stood in front of 80 guests, holding a champagne glass while talking about legacy. He told stories about his own father, Walter Hayes, who had owned a small trucking company decades earlier, before losing it after his death because, according to my father, there was no son to continue it properly. Then he turned toward Grayson. "I'd like everyone to meet the future of Hayes Sterling Group," he announced proudly. "My son, my successor, the man I've been preparing for this responsibility. People clapped enthusiastically while Grayson walked beside him for photographs. I stood near the back of the ballroom, holding a champagne glass I never drank from. Ethan leaned closer and quietly asked, "You okay?" "I'm fine." I placed the untouched glass onto a nearby table. The truth was, I had been fine my entire life. That night, driving home through the dark highways outside Dallas, Ethan stayed silent for almost 20 minutes before finally speaking. "He didn't mention you once. I noticed. You saved that company." "I know." I stared through the windshield at the passing highway lights and thought about my grandfather. My father had spent his whole life terrified of repeating Walter Hayes's mistakes. But somewhere along the way, he created a completely different disaster. I became the first person in the office every morning, 6:30 sharp. Most days, the parking lot was still empty, except for the overnight security guard preparing to leave. I'd badge into the building, walk through dark, silent hallways, and sit in my office beside the server room, where the low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floor. I liked that sound. It meant the systems were running. It meant the numbers were moving exactly the way they were supposed to. Every financial trail inside Hayes Sterling Group eventually passed through my department. Vendor payments, payroll cycles, quarterly SEC filings, revenue recognition, compliance reviews. I checked everything personally, not because my position required it, because I couldn't stop myself. Perfectionism was my flaw. Responsibility was my addiction. I couldn't leave a spreadsheet unresolved if a decimal point looked wrong. I couldn't drive home knowing a payment authorization remained unchecked. 230 employees depended on those numbers being accurate. Mortgages depended on them. Retirement accounts depended on them. Families depended on them. My mother called it unhealthy. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," she used to tell me over the phone. "Your brother understands delegation. You should learn from him." Grayson understood delegation because there was almost nothing real for him to manage. But in my mother's eyes, that made him a natural leader. I stopped arguing with her years earlier because it never changed anything. She always ended those conversations with the same sentence. I'll tell you what that sentence was later. The beginning of everything happened 14 months before the New Year's Eve party. During Thanksgiving dinner, 6 people sat around a dining table built for 12. My parents, Grayson, his girlfriend Madison, Ethan, me. Halfway through dinner, my father casually announced that he wanted to discuss succession planning, except there was nothing casual about it. He explained that Grayson would transition into a co-CEO role by spring and officially take full control of the company the following January. The board would approve the transition. Investors would be informed later in the year. Everything would happen smoothly. No unnecessary drama, my father said confidently. I slowly placed my fork down beside my plate. "Have you considered forming an independent succession committee?" I asked. "Maybe board-level evaluations of executive qualifications?" The room immediately went quiet. My father stared at me like I had insulted him personally. "This isn't a committee issue, Autumn," he replied. "This is family." Grayson leaned back in his chair, smiling slightly without saying a word. He didn't need to say anything. My mother gently touched my arm beneath the table. And there it was, the sentence she always used whenever I became inconvenient. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I picked my fork back up and let the conversation die. But something from that week stayed with me. Grayson's quarterly numbers. His division had recently reported 12 new vendor contracts and massive projected revenue growth. On paper, it looked impressive. Too impressive. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I ran the contracts through our audit systems personally. 12 new vendor agreements, 3 of them traced back to the exact same receiving account under slightly different company names. I printed the reports immediately. Then I took them home and kept them hidden for 2 weeks. That was the real beginning. The vendor was called Blackridge Industrial Partners. Until that audit review, I had never heard the name before. According to our records, the company had entered Hayes Sterling Group's system 8 months earlier as a supplier of specialized logistics components tied directly to Grayson's division. At first glance, everything looked polished enough to avoid attention. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The listed business address was nothing more than a post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. No physical office, no website, no listed executives, no LinkedIn employees, no industry references, no contractor registration, no footprint anywhere that a legitimate vendor operating at that scale should have existed. The payment structure was even worse. Monthly wire transfers. Every transfer carefully placed just below mandatory reporting thresholds. 3 separate entities with slightly different names. Blackridge Industrial Partners LLC, Blackridge Logistics Consulting, Blackridge Supply Holdings. Different names, same bank account. The entire arrangement looked deliberate. Either someone involved had experience hiding money before, or someone had been taught exactly how to avoid attracting attention. I pulled every authorization connected to those payments. Every single approval came from Grayson's department. His assistant processed the paperwork. His signature appeared on the contracts. Over 8 months, more than $1.2 million had been routed to companies that, as far as I could tell, did not provide a single real service. I didn't confront Grayson. I didn't call my father. I didn't go to the board. Instead, I printed everything: contracts, wire confirmations, vendor approvals, bank routing details. I placed all of it inside a folder, zipped my bag closed, and drove home in silence. Ethan was in the kitchen when I walked in, carrying what looked like half an office worth of paper. "What's all that?" he asked. I dropped the folder onto the dining table and poured myself a glass of water before answering. The beginning of something irreversible. He pulled out a chair across from me and waited. That was one of the things I loved most about Ethan. He never rushed me when something mattered. That weekend, we covered the entire dining room table with documents: wire transfers on the left, contracts in the center, corporate registration filings on the right. Ethan stood beside the table, reading everything upside down while I explained the connections. At the time, he worked for a litigation firm handling corporate compliance investigations. Not exactly securities law, but close enough to understand what we were looking at. After 20 minutes, he pointed toward one of the Delaware registration forms. "Shell Company," he said quietly. The document listed a man named Daniel Mercer as the sole registered member. "Do you know him?" Ethan asked. "No, but Grayson attended a trade conference in Atlanta 14 months ago." I pulled another page from the folder. Daniel Mercer was listed as a vendor representative there. Ethan exhaled slowly. "If this is what it looks like, this isn't just internal fraud anymore," he said. "The company is public. Those vendor payments affect quarterly filings, investor disclosures, SEC reporting." I already understood what he meant: securities fraud, federal exposure, potential criminal liability. "I know," I said softly. He stayed quiet for a moment before looking directly at me. "You need to file a whistleblower complaint." I shook my head immediately. "I'm not doing this for money." "I know that," he replied. "But if you bring this to your father privately, he'll bury it. And if he buries it, eventually the company collapses under the weight of it. The employees suffer, the shareholders suffer. Everyone pays for Grayson's mess." I hated how right he was. If I handled this inside the family, it would disappear. Not because the evidence was weak, because Richard Hayes controlled too many people. "For the record," I finally said, "that December, 13 months before the New Year's Eve party, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after Ethan went upstairs to bed. My laptop screen glowed against the dark room while the SEC whistleblower submission portal sat open in front of me. The form was long: company details, violation summaries, supporting documentation, submission categories. I spent nearly 2 hours typing every detail I knew about Blackridge: the payment structures, the multiple entities, the vendor irregularities, Grayson's approvals, the suspicious contracts. Then I attached scanned copies of the documents. At 11:47 p.m., I pressed submit. A confirmation page appeared seconds later. "Tip accepted. Reference number assigned." A notification buzzed across my phone almost immediately. I stared at the confirmation number longer than I expected to, because for the first time, someone outside my family now knew the truth. Someone beyond my father's influence. Someone who couldn't be manipulated with loyalty or guilt. I took screenshots of everything, saved the files onto an encrypted drive, and locked it inside the home safe beside our marriage certificate and Ethan's grandfather's watch. The following Monday morning, I returned to work exactly the way I always did. 6:30, dark parking lot, security guard heading home, quarterly reports waiting on my desk. I completed every task perfectly. That mattered to me. I wasn't sabotaging the company. I was protecting it better than anyone else inside that building. At the same time, I quietly started building a second file offline. Every Blackridge payment, every authorization trail, every internal email connected to Grayson's department, everything organized by date and category. That same week, the company held its annual holiday celebration in the cafeteria. My father stood near the center of the room holding champagne while congratulating everyone on another incredible year of growth. People applauded. Grayson smiled like he owned the future. I stood there holding a drink I never touched and smiled whenever someone looked in my direction. If you've ever watched someone take credit for work you sacrificed years to build, you understand that kind of exhaustion. 3 months after my initial submission, the SEC finally contacted me. Not through a phone call, not through a letter, through the secure portal itself. An investigator had reviewed my complaint and opened a preliminary investigation into Hayes Sterling Group. They requested additional supporting documentation, specifically vendor onboarding records, payment workflows, approval chains, internal communications between business development and accounts payable. I had access to all of it because I was vice president of finance. Those files belonged to my department. Gathering them wasn't espionage, it was literally my job. Over the next month, I compiled a second submission. Payment records first, vendor registrations second, internal correspondence last. I uploaded everything through the encrypted portal one Sunday evening, while Ethan sat nearby reading on the couch. "Done?" he asked without looking up. "Second batch," I answered. "How many more?" "At least one, maybe two," he nodded. Neither of us spoke about it again that night. At work, life continued as if nothing was wrong. My father scheduled a company-wide town hall meeting the following month. The calendar invitation carried a subject line everyone immediately understood: the future of Hayes Sterling Group. Translation: Grayson's coronation. My assistant Claire added it to my calendar and lingered awkwardly in my office doorway. "Should I block travel that week?" she asked carefully. "No," I replied. "I'll be here." She studied me for a second too long before leaving. Claire had worked with me for 6 years. She noticed things other people missed. The morning of the town hall, I checked the SEC portal before leaving for work. Case status: active. Under review. Waiting for supplemental evidence. I had plenty more coming. The town hall filled the company conference center to standing room capacity. Employees lined the back walls while executives occupied the front rows. My father arrived with a podium and a professionally designed presentation deck. The opening slide displayed Grayson's photograph beneath giant silver lettering. Leadership Transition Plan. Grayson wore the exact expression politicians practice in mirrors. Confident. Approachable. Completely artificial. My father spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the history of the company, the future of leadership, and the importance of vision. Then he looked directly at Grayson. "Every successful company eventually needs someone who understands relationships as much as numbers," he announced proudly. "Someone capable of leading people into the future." He paused dramatically. "I'm proud to announce that my son, Grayson Hayes, will begin transitioning into the role of co-CEO this spring." Applause filled the room, but not enthusiastic applause, polite applause. The kind people give because they understand they're expected to clap. Grayson stepped to the podium afterward and delivered a carefully rehearsed speech that sounded like it had been written by consultants. He thanked the employees. He thanked the board. He thanked our father. He never mentioned me once. After the meeting, Claire closed my office door behind her. "He didn't even say your name," she said quietly. I kept reviewing paperwork without looking up. "You rebuilt the audit systems," she continued. "You're the reason payroll survived during the crisis." "Claire." She stopped talking. I finally looked at her. "I know what I've done," I said calmly. "I don't need Grayson to announce it." That evening, my mother called me. "Wasn't the presentation wonderful?" she asked brightly. "Your brother looked so presidential." I almost laughed. "Presidential?" I repeated. "He looked like someone practicing in front of a bathroom mirror." Silence. Then my mother said my name the way she always did when disapproval replaced affection. Autumn. Just that. One word. Sharp enough to end the conversation. Late May. Most employees had already gone home by 6 o'clock, but I was still in my office reviewing quarterly vendor reconciliations. The building had settled into that familiar evening silence I knew better than my own neighborhood. My father was away at a golf fundraiser in South Carolina and wouldn't return until Monday. I needed access to the physical vendor files. Richard Hayes believed in paper copies the same way some people believed in religion. Digital backups existed on secure servers, but original contracts were always locked inside a filing cabinet behind his desk. Paper doesn't crash, he liked to say. I had watched him open that cabinet hundreds of times over the years. The key always stayed hidden in the same place, the top right drawer of his desk behind a box of engraved pens he'd received for his 50th birthday. That evening, I walked into his dark office alone. The hallway light spilled across the carpet in narrow golden stripes while I opened the desk drawer and reached behind the pens. My fingers closed around the small brass key immediately. Same scratches, same worn edges. I unlocked the cabinet carefully. Third folder from the front, current vendor contracts. Inside were 12 vendor files arranged alphabetically. The sixth folder carried the name I was looking for, Blackridge Industrial Partners. I opened it slowly. The original contract sat inside with Grayson's signature across the bottom, beside Daniel Mercer's countersignature. The agreement described logistics consulting services so vague they barely qualified as language. No measurable deliverables, no performance metrics, just recurring monthly payments. A perfect funnel for stolen money. I photographed every page, front and back, 17 images total. Then I returned the folder exactly where I found it, locked the cabinet, placed the key back behind the engraved pens, and walked out without leaving a single thing disturbed. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from certainty. 14 months earlier, I had only suspected fraud. Now I held proof. A few weeks later, I met with someone who changed everything. Margaret Holloway had served on Hayes Sterling's board for almost a decade. Former CFO of a national packaging company 3 times larger than ours. Sharp-minded, impossible to intimidate. The kind of woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and still made corporate attorneys nervous during meetings. She had quietly become my mentor during my second year at the company. Once a month, we met for coffee near downtown Dallas. No agendas, no politics, just conversation. That June, I asked her a question I had never asked before. When you were CFO, I said carefully, did you ever encounter vendor contracts that didn't make sense? Margaret slowly lowered her coffee cup. Once, she answered. I brought it to the board. They formed a review committee. The committee met twice. Then the contract was reclassified as consulting work and nobody mentioned it again. What happened to the vendor? As far as I know, they still exist. She paused. Then she looked directly at me. Is this about Blackridge? My coffee stopped halfway to my mouth. Margaret leaned back slightly. I'm 60 years old, Autumn, she said calmly. I've spent 4 decades reading financial statements. 3 vendor entities tied to 1 receiving account? Repeated payments below reporting thresholds? I noticed it months ago. Why didn't you say anything? Because the last time I spoke up inside a company like this, I learned something important. She folded her hands neatly on the table. Speaking the truth inside certain organizations doesn't change the system. It only changes who gets pushed out. I stared at her silently. Then she added, but you have advantages I didn't have. Like what? Young enough to fight, access to the records, and a husband who understands corporate litigation. I never confirmed anything directly. She never asked me to. Instead, she picked up her coffee and said quietly, whatever path you're on, finish it. We spent the rest of lunch discussing weather and gardening, like two normal people having a perfectly ordinary conversation. We never mentioned Blackridge again. That June, I submitted a third package to the SEC. This time, the evidence had faces attached to it. I uploaded the photographs of the original Blackridge contracts, showing Grayson's signatures clearly visible beside Daniel Mercer's. I included Delaware registration documents, identifying Mercer as the sole member of the shell companies. I attached conference records proving Grayson and Mercer attended the same industry convention in Atlanta. 1 week later, the SEC investigator responded through the portal. The documentation is substantial. We are building a formal enforcement file. To proceed further, we require evidence demonstrating executive-level knowledge of the arrangement. Executive-level knowledge. They meant my father. The investigators wanted proof Richard Hayes knew about the fraud. I spent an entire week staring at that message. Not because I doubted the answer, because proving it would permanently destroy whatever remained of my relationship with him. The following Tuesday, my father unexpectedly invited me to lunch downtown, just the two of us. That almost never happened. We sat inside a steakhouse filled with executives pretending not to eavesdrop on one another's conversations. My father ordered bourbon before noon and leaned back comfortably in his chair. "I know this succession plan has been difficult for you," he said. I watched him quietly. "You've contributed more to this company than most people realize," he continued. "But passing leadership to Grayson is the right decision for the family." The family, meaning the son. I looked across the table at the man who built an empire while confusing a last name with competence. "I understand," I told him. But the truth was much colder than that. I understood far more than he realized. The evidence the SEC needed was somewhere inside his office, hidden behind a brass key. August arrived hot and brutal. One Wednesday evening, while my father attended investor meetings in New York, I returned to the office after most employees had gone home. 7 p.m., empty hallways, motion-sensitive lights flickering awake as I walked. The building felt almost abandoned. I opened my father's desk drawer and retrieved the brass key again. Same weight, same scratches. This time I wasn't looking for contracts. I was searching for something I had noticed during my previous visit but hadn't touched. A separate folder labeled GH Vendor Review, Grayson Hayes. Inside sat a printed email chain, 4 pages, 11 months old. The subject line made my stomach tighten immediately. Blackridge, handle quietly. The first email came from Grayson. "Dad, the Blackridge invoice for Q3 is ready. Same structure as before. Daniel says he needs the transfer completed by Friday." Below it was my father's response. "I have reviewed the arrangement. The numbers work for the quarter. Make sure the invoices remain under the threshold. I'll handle any board questions." I read the message once, then again, then a third time. Every excuse I had made for my father collapsed in less than 30 seconds. Richard Hayes knew. Worse than that, he directed it. "I'll handle any board questions," as casually as if he were discussing dinner reservations. I photographed every page carefully before restoring the folder exactly where I found it. Lock cabinet, return key, close drawer, leave office. At home, Ethan sat at the kitchen table while I handed him my phone silently. He read the photographs slowly. Then he closed his eyes for a second. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is the executive-level evidence they needed." I took the phone back and stared at my father's words glowing across the screen. The man obsessed with preserving his legacy had built an entire wall around his son's fraud and convinced himself it was loyalty. That weekend, I submitted the emails through the SEC portal. Confirmation arrived less than 2 hours later. By September, the investigation officially entered formal enforcement review. "Timeline?" I asked the investigator. "Months, not weeks. I could wait. I had spent most of my life waiting for people to recognize reality. A few more months didn't matter. At the office, life kept moving like nothing was wrong. Grayson began redecorating my father's future office before the transition had even happened. New desk, new shelves, custom nameplate reading, Grayson Hayes, CEO. Every morning I walked past it on my way to the server room. Every single morning. In October, the board officially voted on the CEO transition plan.
Grayson Hayes would assume leadership effective January 1st. 5 votes approved it, 2 opposed it. Margaret Holloway voted no. She never explained herself. She didn't need to. I abstained due to family conflict. Officially, it was protocol. Unofficially, it felt like watching a train continue moving toward a bridge I already knew was collapsing. That evening, I sat in my car outside the office for nearly 15 minutes before turning the engine on. Ethan called while I stared through the windshield. How'd it go? 5-2. They approved it? January 1st. Silence. Then he asked softly, "What do you still need?" "One more signature." "What kind?" "A current contract." I stared at the glowing office windows. Something recent enough to prove the scheme is still active. When? Soon. Grayson always pushes large vendor approvals before year end. And then? I finally started the engine. And then I finished this. November arrived with cold rain and year-end pressure settling across every department inside Hayes Sterling Group. 3 days before Thanksgiving, a purchase order landed on my desk. Routing slip attached. Originating division. Business development. Vendor. Blackridge Logistics Consulting. Contract amount $890,000. Description. Strategic Logistics Advisory Services. Duration 6 months. It was the largest single Blackridge contract I had seen yet. Under company policy, any vendor agreement exceeding $500,000 required approval from the Vice President of Finance, which meant Grayson needed my signature. The paperwork sat on my desk for nearly an hour while I studied it. I remember staring at the documents the way surgeons probably study x-rays before telling patients the truth. Detached, clinical, calm on the outside while fully understanding the damage underneath. Then I signed it. Not because I supported it, not because I doubted what was happening, because refusing to approve it without formal justification would have triggered questions too early. And because the SEC needed evidence proving the fraud was ongoing, fresh contracts, fresh signatures, fresh wire authorizations, proof the scheme was still alive. Grayson never even realized the paperwork crossed my desk personally. His assistant routed it through the standard approval chain like every other transaction. To him, I was just another checkbox inside the system I had built. That night, after dinner, I scanned every page. The contract, the routing slips, the transfer authorizations. Then I uploaded them into the SEC portal as supplemental evidence. By that point, the case file contained everything: shell company registrations, payment records, 18 months of fraudulent contracts, my father's email directing concealment, and now the newest transaction carrying my own authorization signature beneath Grayson's. Vice President of Finance performing her job while unknowingly approving her brother's fraud. I closed my laptop slowly afterward and sent Ethan a single text message. Done. A minute later, he replied with only one character. A period. No speech, no celebration, just acknowledgement. Everything now existed inside federal records. All that remained was timing. The invitation arrived during the first week of December. Heavy cream-colored cardstock, gold trim, engraved lettering. Richard and Elaine Hayes request the pleasure of your presence at their annual New Year's Eve celebration. A special announcement will be made at midnight. Black tie attire, estate ballroom, RSVP by December 15th. I stood in my kitchen reading the invitation twice before placing it beside the fruit bowl on the counter. A special announcement. Midnight. 140 guests. I already knew exactly what the announcement would be. My father would publicly hand the company to Grayson while wealthy investors applauded and champagne flowed like water. A coronation disguised as a party. My mother called later that afternoon. "Did you receive the invitation?" I did. "Wear something elegant, sweetheart. This is an important night for your brother." There it was again. That same tone she had used my entire life. Gentle enough to sound caring, sharp enough to make me smaller. "And Autumn," she added quietly. "Yes, Mom?" "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The exact same sentence. The same 6 words she used every time I threatened the story they preferred telling themselves. I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes briefly. "I'll be there." "Good," she answered warmly. "Your father really wants the family together for this." After we hung up, I walked into my home office and opened the SEC portal again. 14 months of evidence stared back at me: contracts, wire records, approval chains, corporate registrations, emails, photos, everything waiting inside a federal system for one final action. I closed the laptop and returned to the kitchen. Then I opened my closet and selected what I would wear that night: a structured black dress, silver earrings, simple, sharp. The kind of outfit that didn't beg for attention but refused to disappear into the background. I wasn't attending that party to celebrate. I was attending because I intended to finish something. Mid-December, my attorney called. Not Ethan, my own attorney. I had hired her through a completely separate firm months earlier to avoid conflicts of interest. Her name was Victoria Hale, and she spoke with the efficiency of someone who billed by the minute. The SEC confirmed the investigation remains active, she said immediately. Formal enforcement referral is likely. I sat quietly at my desk listening. If additional supporting evidence is submitted before the leadership transition becomes official, she continued, it establishes a documented timeline proving federal regulators possessed material information before the succession occurred. Meaning, if the SEC received everything before midnight on New Year's Eve, there would be permanent evidence that the government knew Grayson was under investigation before my father publicly handed him control of the company. The timing matters, I said. The timing matters enormously. After that call, I spent 2 weeks preparing the final supplemental filing: 42 pages, a complete timeline, every Blackridge transaction from beginning to end, cross-reference travel records, vendor registrations, my father's emails, the November contract, every piece organized into one document impossible to dismiss as coincidence. When I finished, I converted the file into a single PDF and uploaded it into the SEC submission portal. Draft status: saved, but not submitted. One gray button remained at the bottom of the screen: approve and submit. That was it. One button separating silence from collapse. One night, while Ethan washed dishes after dinner, he looked over his shoulder and asked quietly, "When are you sending it?" "Midnight." He didn't ask why. He already understood. My father had chosen midnight for his performance. He had chosen the audience. He had chosen the stage. I was simply choosing the same clock. December 31st arrived cold and gray. I woke up at 6:15 out of habit. Ethan was already sitting on the edge of the bed fully dressed when I opened my eyes. Neither of us mentioned the party immediately. I went downstairs, made coffee, burned one piece of toast because my hands weren't steady enough to focus properly. Normal morning, ordinary routine, last day of the year. I opened the SEC portal on my phone while sitting at the kitchen table. The 42-page filing waited exactly where I left it. Draft status, approve, and submit. I closed the app without touching the button. At 8:37 that morning, Grayson texted me. "Sis, tonight is going to be incredible. Dad has a huge surprise planned. You should see how much champagne they ordered." I stared at the message for several seconds before typing back, "Can't wait." Then I deleted the period at the end. Then I typed it again with the period included. Ethan walked downstairs while I was still looking at my phone. "You okay?" "Ask me tomorrow." He poured himself coffee and sat across from me quietly. There were no more folders spread across our dining room table anymore. No stacks of printed contracts. No highlighted bank records. Everything existed digitally now. 14 months of evidence compressed into one federal submission, waiting for a thumbprint. At 4 in the afternoon, I showered and pinned my hair into a tight twist. Then I put on the black dress and silver earrings before standing in front of the bathroom mirror. I didn't look like someone preparing to destroy her brother's career and expose her father to federal investigators. I looked like someone going to a formal New Year's Eve party. That was the point. Ethan drove us to the estate just after sunset, 45 minutes from our neighborhood to the family property. Highway first, then county roads, then the long gravel driveway lined with catering vans and valet attendants carrying umbrellas through the winter air. Bare trees surrounded the property like dark silhouettes against the evening sky. The house glowed ahead of us through the branches. Lights filled every window. A massive white event tent stretched across the rear terrace. Music from the band drifted faintly through the cold air before we even parked. You don't have to do this tonight, Ethan said quietly while turning off the engine. I looked straight ahead through the windshield. I was never going to do it any other night. He studied me carefully. They made this public, I continued. 140 witnesses, champagne, a stage, reporters. They chose the audience, not me. My phone buzzed inside my clutch. Message from Victoria. Portal operational. Ready when you are. I read it without replying and slipped the phone away. Then Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand once. Not the squeeze people give when they're afraid. The squeeze people give when they're ready. Let's go, I said. The ballroom looked exactly the way my father believed success should look. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across polished hardwood floors. A 12-piece orchestra played old standards near the stage, while servers in black vests moved through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and tiny appetizers nobody actually ate. 3 enormous champagne towers glittered beneath the lights like sculptures. 140 guests filled the room: board members, investors, business reporters, politicians, corporate attorneys billing $400 an hour just to stand near power. My father stood near the terrace doors holding a bourbon glass, while Grayson remained beside him, accepting congratulations before the announcement had even happened. Grayson wore a dark tailored suit and the expensive watch my mother had proudly texted me pictures of on Christmas morning. "Isn't it beautiful?" she had written. I never answered. My mother floated beside him, adjusting his collar and smoothing invisible wrinkles from his jacket, like she was preparing a prince for a coronation. I walked through the room smiling politely at people who congratulated me for reasons they didn't understand. "Happy New Year. So wonderful to see you. The ballroom looks incredible." Easy conversations, automatic responses. Years of executive dinners had taught me how to sound relaxed while emotionally absent. Near the bar, Margaret Holloway lifted her water glass slightly when our eyes met across the room. No smile, no words, just acknowledgement. I checked my phone discreetly. 10:47 p.m. The SEC portal still displayed the draft submission waiting for authorization. Approve and submit. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my clutch before taking a champagne glass from a passing tray. I still didn't drink it. By 11:15, the party had settled into full momentum. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. The orchestra played Sinatra while couples drifted toward the dance floor. Somewhere behind me, someone uncorked another bottle of champagne and people applauded for no reason other than excess. I touched Ethan's arm lightly. "I'll be back in a minute." He looked at me and immediately understood. "Take your time." I left the ballroom and walked alone through the east hallway of the estate. The farther I moved from the music, the quieter the house became, until all I could hear were my own footsteps against hardwood floors. My father's office door stood partially open at the end of the hallway. Dark room, silent. The filing cabinet remained against the wall exactly where it always had. The desk looked untouched. Pen holder, family photo, top right drawer. I opened it slowly. The brass key still rested behind the engraved pens. Same place, same scratches, same worn metal pressing into my palm. For a moment, I simply stood there holding it. 14 months earlier, that key represented fear, secrets, evidence. Now it represented something else entirely. The cabinet no longer mattered. Every important document already existed inside federal records: the contracts, the payment trails, the emails, my father's instructions, Grayson's signatures, everything safely stored on government servers beyond Richard Hayes's reach. I placed the key back exactly where I found it and closed the drawer gently. Then I stood alone inside my father's dark office, listening to the muffled music vibrating faintly through the walls, the orchestra, laughter, champagne glasses clinking together, an entire family celebration balanced on top of a lie already collapsing underneath it. After a few seconds, I turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Ethan waited near the terrace doors holding my untouched champagne glass. "You left this," he said quietly. I took it from him. "Done?" he asked. "There was nothing left to do," I answered. "I just needed to put something back." He nodded once, without asking questions. At 11:58, the orchestra stopped playing mid-song. My father stepped onto the stage while someone handed him a microphone and a fresh champagne glass filled nearly to the top. The room immediately quieted. 140 faces turned toward him. The chandeliers reflected light across the ceiling like fractured diamonds, while Richard Hayes smiled at the crowd with the confidence of a man preparing to preserve his legacy forever. 30 years ago, he began, I started this company with one truck, one warehouse, and 3 banks willing to take a chance on me. Warm laughter moved through the audience. He was good at this. Always had been. He spoke about sacrifice, growth, expansion, the company's public offering. 230 employees depending on Hayes Sterling Group for their livelihoods every 2 weeks. Then his eyes found Grayson standing near the stage. But eventually, every founder faces the same question. My father continued. Who carries it forward? Who do you trust with the future of everything you built? He raised his champagne glass. The audience raised theirs with him. Tonight, he announced proudly, at the beginning of a new year, I officially place Hayes Sterling Group into the hands of my son, Grayson Hayes. Applause exploded through the ballroom. My father's voice caught slightly before he finished. The one who truly earned it. People stood, cheered. Champagne lifted everywhere. Grayson climbed onto the stage, grinning while photographers snapped pictures from the front rows. My mother wiped tears from her eyes with a folded napkin like she was witnessing something sacred. I stood near the back wall, holding my champagne glass untouched. Then Ethan's hand found mine beneath my clutch. The second squeeze, the one that meant now. Someone in the crowd started the countdown. 10, 9, 8. The ballroom joined together loudly. 7. I opened my clutch and pulled out my phone. 6. The SEC portal loaded immediately. 5. 42 pages. 3 shell companies. 18 months of fraud. 1 executive cover-up. 1 complete timeline. 4. The gray button waited at the bottom of the screen. Approve and submit. 3. Ethan leaned slightly toward me. You're sure? 2. I looked at the stage where my father stood beside Grayson, smiling beneath the chandeliers, while the room celebrated a future built on lies. I've been sure for 14 months. 1. Midnight exploded around us. Fireworks erupted outside beyond the terrace windows, scattering gold across the dark sky. Confetti rained from the ceiling while champagne corks burst through the ballroom in every direction. The orchestra launched into music again. People screamed, laughed, celebrated, and I pressed the button. The screen paused for half a second. Loading. Then the confirmation appeared. Submission received. SEC reference number assigned. Timestamp. 12:03 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 seconds after midnight. The old year ended. The new year began with evidence. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my clutch, and finally took my first sip of champagne. The bubbles were still fresh. A vibration buzzed inside my purse almost immediately. Confirmation email received. Same notification sound I heard 13 months earlier when the first submission was accepted. I silenced it without looking. Ethan wrapped one arm around my waist and pulled me gently closer. Happy New Year, he whispered. I looked across the ballroom at my father and brother standing beneath the lights while confetti drifted slowly toward the floor. Happy New Year. For 11 minutes, nothing changed. The orchestra played, people danced, investors congratulated Grayson. My mother posed for photographs. Ethan and I even danced briefly to one slow song while my phone rested inside my clutch, carrying the most expensive email I had ever sent. 11 minutes of normal. Then the first phone buzzed. 12:11 a.m. Marcus Reed, my father's chief of staff, stood near the bar holding a whiskey glass when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen casually at first. Then he read it again, and his face changed. Not panic, not shock, calculation. Hayes Sterling's outside law firm maintained automatic SEC monitoring alerts for any regulatory filing mentioning the company's name. Most corporations used systems like that. Nobody thinks about them until the alert finally activates. Marcus slowly placed his drink down and walked toward my father. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. the pace of someone carrying information that could not be taken back once spoken aloud. My father still stood near the terrace doors, smiling beside a board member, when Marcus leaned close and whispered into his ear. I couldn't hear the words from across the ballroom. I didn't need to. I watched my father's expression collapse instantly, not gradually, instantly, like someone shutting off a light. He lowered his champagne glass onto the nearest table without drinking from it. The bubbles kept rising untouched while he whispered something urgently back to Marcus. Marcus shook his head once. My father looked across the room, searching through guests, dancers, reporters, and servers, until his eyes finally found me standing against the far wall beside Ethan. I didn't look away, neither did he. For several long seconds, we simply stared at each other across the ballroom while the party continued collapsing around us in slow motion. Then my father turned sharply toward the company attorney standing near the bar. At 12:13, the lawyers gathered near the terrace doors, speaking in tight, urgent whispers while checking phones. Grayson noticed immediately. He crossed the ballroom still holding his champagne glass. "Dad, what's going on?" My father refused to look directly at him. "Not now. People are asking me questions about the transition announcement." I said not now. Grayson's smile disappeared. For the first time all night, he looked uncertain. Whispers spread quickly after that. Board members checking phones, guests exchanging nervous glances, conversations breaking apart mid-sentence. Across the room, Margaret Holloway stood near the dessert table, sipping water calmly while watching everything unfold. Patient, silent, like someone who already knew how the story ended. At 12:17, my father walked back onto the stage. The orchestra stopped immediately when he raised one hand. Music cut off mid-note. Silence crashed across the ballroom. 140 faces turned toward him again. But this time the room felt different. Tight, rigid, afraid. My father gripped the microphone with one hand. His voice remained controlled. Barely. "I need to make an additional announcement." The silence deepened. "Due to a regulatory matter that has just come to our attention," he continued carefully, "the leadership transition announced earlier this evening is being placed on immediate hold." Complete silence. The kind where you could actually hear champagne bubbles breaking inside glasses. Grayson stared at him from 3 feet away. "What?" My father avoided his eyes. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "Grayson," he said quietly, "not here. You just announced me as CEO in front of everyone in this room." I said not here. His authority cracked on the last word, not emotionally, structurally, like something underneath him had finally broken. Around the ballroom, people began reaching for coats. The orchestra never resumed playing. By 12:25, the party had started dissolving into confusion. Guests moved toward the exits in awkward clusters, speaking too quietly for a celebration and too politely for a disaster. "Thank you for the lovely evening. Happy New Year. Drive safely." The language people use when they know something terrible happened, but don't yet understand exactly what they witnessed. Outside the terrace doors, Grayson paced back and forth with his phone pressed against his ear. Even through the glass, I could hear panic sharpening his voice. I walked toward the front hallway to collect my coat. Near the staircase, my father sat alone on a narrow bench with his elbows resting on his knees and his suit jacket hanging open. He looked older than he had 2 hours earlier, much older. The kind of aging that happens all at once when certainty disappears. When he saw me, he didn't stand. "It was you." Not a question. I stayed silent. He looked down at the floor for a moment before asking quietly, "How long?" 14 months. A slow breath left his chest. Not anger, exhaustion. "I knew about Blackridge," he admitted finally. "I thought I could contain it, restructure things quietly before anyone noticed." "You weren't fixing it," I said calmly. "You were hiding it." He rubbed both hands together slowly and stared at the hardwood floor. "My father lost everything because he didn't have a son to carry the business forward," he said. "I promised myself I would never let that happen again." Then he looked up at me. His eyes were red but dry. "I knew Grayson wasn't ready," he admitted softly. "I just couldn't let my father be right." The sentence hung in the hallway between us. My father, 63 years old, sitting alone while his New Year's celebration collapsed room by room around him because he spent his entire life trying to prove something to a dead man. I looked at him quietly. Grandpa didn't lose his company because he had daughters, I said. He lost it because he never trusted them. For a second, he said nothing. Then my mother appeared at the far end of the hallway wearing her coat and carrying her purse tightly beneath one arm. Her face wasn't sad. It was furious. She walked toward us quickly, heels striking the hardwood with sharp, angry clicks. My father didn't move. Do you understand what you've done? She demanded the moment she reached me. Her voice stayed controlled the way it always had when she wanted to smooth over cracks before anyone else noticed them. To this family, she continued, to your father, to everything he built. I waited. I already knew what sentence was coming next, and there it was. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The exact same words she had used my entire life, every Thanksgiving, every disagreement, every moment I tried to speak honestly about something this family didn't want to face. But this time, something inside me finally stopped shrinking. It was already hard, Mom, I said quietly. You just never noticed because I carried it alone. For the first time in my life, Elaine Hayes had no response. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. No redirect, no polished explanation, no emotional performance capable of repairing the moment. She simply stared at me. Then she turned around and walked toward the front door without another word. A few seconds later, Ethan appeared carrying my coat over one arm. He handed it to me gently. I put it on. Then we walked outside together. The long gravel driveway was filled with departing cars. Red taillights disappeared slowly through the dark trees while catering staff quietly packed equipment beneath the cold white tent near the terrace. The estate still glowed behind us, every window lit, a massive house full of empty light. I stopped beside the car and looked back one final time. Everything my father built was still standing, but the illusion holding it together was gone. Ethan opened the passenger door for me. I got inside. For the first 20 minutes of the drive home, neither of us spoke. Finally, he glanced over briefly and asked, You okay? I looked out at the dark highway ahead of us. Not yet. Then after a moment, I added quietly, But I will be. January arrived in waves. The first week, Hayes Sterling Group filed an emergency disclosure with the SEC announcing an internal investigation into vendor-related financial misconduct connected to the business development division. The company stock dropped 14% in 2 trading days. Regional business papers ran headlines across their front pages. Hayes Sterling under federal review. The second week, the board held an emergency session lasting nearly 6 hours behind closed doors. When they finally emerged, Richard Hayes agreed to step aside as CEO pending the outcome of the investigation. No transition period, no severance negotiation, immediate resignation. Margaret Holloway became interim board chair. During the third week, Grayson was placed on administrative leave. His executive access was revoked. Company accounts connected to Blackridge were frozen by court order. Daniel Mercer received a federal subpoena at his home outside Atlanta. Then the board approached me. They asked if I would serve as interim chief financial officer. I accepted. My first action was ordering a complete vendor audit across every Hayes Sterling facility. Transparent, documented, independent, exactly the way things should have been handled from the beginning. And something important happened afterward. The company survived. Payroll never stopped. Employees kept their jobs. Operations continued. Within 60 days, I replaced every Blackridge contract with verified vendors and rebuilt the compliance systems from the ground up. For the first time in years, the numbers were clean, every payment traceable, every vendor real, every report accurate. Grayson called me once during February. I let it go to voicemail. His message lasted less than 15 seconds. I hope you're happy. I deleted it immediately. My father sent something different, a handwritten letter on personal stationery, only 2 sentences. You were always the backbone of this company. I was too blind to admit it. I read the note once, folded it carefully, placed it inside my desk drawer. I never answered. One afternoon during a finance committee meeting, A newly appointed board member asked how I eventually became CFO. I looked across the conference table at her and answered calmly. I was the one who actually earned it. The room went silent. Across the table, Margaret Holloway smiled into her water glass. I didn't say the words to be clever. I said them because they were true, and because the last person who used them had been completely wrong. In March, Victoria informed me the SEC enforcement case was still progressing. Estimated sanctions now exceeded $4 million. Under whistleblower laws, I qualified for a percentage of whatever penalties the government recovered. I told her I didn't want to think about the money yet. Instead, I thought about the quarterly audits sitting on my desk, perfectly clean, no shell vendors, no hidden payments, no false reporting, just truth. That spring, Ethan and I planted a garden behind our house. Tomatoes, basil, rosemary. Simple things that grew honestly because someone cared for them consistently. At work, I hired 2 new financial analysts and promoted Claire into a leadership role. She cried for approximately 4 seconds in my office before regaining composure and asking when she could start. My mother called once near the end of March. Your father isn't doing well, she said carefully. The stress has affected his blood pressure. I'm sorry to hear that. There was a pause. He misses you. I looked out the window at the small garden Ethan was building in the backyard. He can call me when he's ready to speak honestly. He never called, and strangely, that became okay, because there was finally a boundary between us. Clear, visible, permanent. I still loved my father, but I no longer trusted him, and eventually I learned those are not the same thing. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to let them use you. You can miss someone and still lock the door. Spring arrived early that year. The tomatoes grew faster than expected. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan built a wooden trellis in the backyard while I watched from the kitchen window holding coffee in both hands. And standing there, I realized something I wish I had understood years earlier. Peace isn't something people hand you when you stay quiet long enough. Peace is something you build after deciding you deserve honesty more than approval. For most of my life, I believed earning your place in a family meant being useful, working harder, staying silent, cleaning up everyone else's mistakes without asking for recognition. But earning your place has nothing to do with how much pain you tolerate for other people. It depends on what you finally refuse to let them take from you. And the truth doesn't need chandeliers, or orchestras, or champagne towers. It only needs one person willing to press send, and that's where my story ends. 14 months of silence, one decision at midnight, and the moment everything finally changed. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with evidence, truth, and the courage to stop protecting people who never protected you. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that their voice matters too.